What's the first movie you think of when you hear the word cinematic? Maybe it would be something like Dune 2, or Lawrence of Arabia, or Metropolis. Expansive, ambitious, and imaginative films like these do hit at a big strength of film. The ability to create something that we can't, or perhaps just won't, experience. Showing us something strikingly beyond ordinary life is something special for film. But cinematic is not just descriptive of scale. Film has the power to externalize emotion, to use everything, even barely noticeable elements within the frame, or even outside of the frame, to point at ideas and to symbolize. It's a medium of the small scale just as much as a medium of the large scale. The weight and awe of simple moments can be just as impactful as the weight and awe of grand spectacle. And in this video, I will use 4 scenes from The Graduate to illustrate the cinematic small scale. The Graduate is a relatively unassuming film. Certainly, I think that few people would list a sitcom among the most cinematic films. Even so, I think the ways in which The Graduate becomes so heightened to something so special for me is through the ways that only film can communicate. It is the essence of the cinematic to me. It's utilizing the medium to its fullest potential, no matter what the context. It wouldn't be what it is without the performances and the writing, things like that, the perhaps the most commonly recognized elements of film. But these cinematic elements are the things that make this film something truly special. Just to note, this is not supposed to be a complete breakdown analysis of the film. It's just like a bite-sized look at a few elements that stand out to me as things that elevate the film that are cinematic. There's much more to get into. If you're interested, I would certainly recommend seeking out Howard Suber's commentary track on The Graduate. I will also recommend that you watch the film before this video, even though it doesn't really matter. I won't be spoiling anything, and I'm picking examples from the first act, so you won't learn all that much about the film, but it'll be easier to pick up on context and whatnot if you've seen the film first. The Graduate is a 1967 comedy drama directed by Mike Nichols and starring Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft. It's a timeless film about Benjamin, who is a recent college graduate, worried about his future, and soon caught in a love triangle between an older woman and her daughter. Chiefly, the film is speaking to alienation, isolation, the difficulty of transitioning to adulthood from childhood, the difficulty of becoming a man in Ben's case. So something cinematic we can look at is the way those ideas are communicated in technical and artistic ways. This is the first main scene of the film, so to speak, right after the credits and including the transition, I think, for my illustration. Benjamin is flying home and presumably meeting his parents at the airport. The first thing we get is this contrast in the edit between, his smile as he's arriving home, greeting his parents who we don't see, and him sitting at home in the dark with his fish tank. We sit with him for a few seconds in silence, kind of soaking in his mental state through the lighting, through the silence, hearing the sound of the fish tank, in contrast to the brighter lighting, the more welcoming atmosphere of the airport. The emotion is clear by the flow of that edit, by the lighting, and by even the sound itself as it drops off from, hello darkness, my old friend, into just the silence of sitting with Ben. After this, the father enters the room, and we get, to me, one of the most visually striking scenes in the film. Both he, and eventually the mother, when she comes in, block the eye line between us and Ben, which is, of course, pretty uncommon. This is a conspicuous choice, and it's good to remember that conspicuous choices in film are usually made for a specific reason. There is a theme in the film of Ben having essentially no agency and having to learn to overcome that, being overridden and undervalued by adults in this new adult world. The visual choice here demonstrates that he is being overridden, taken for granted perhaps, having his alone time dominated by his parents, by their faces and their bodies, being out of focus even, while the focus is still on Ben. It's like we're trying to get to Ben, but there are just these things in the way, blocking him and suffocating him. You can see this motif continued later in the film, this pool scene here, where, again, the parents blocking out the source of light, looking almost like inhuman, weird, faceless phantoms in the way the scene is shot, which I also love this shot too. And then another element in the scene is the aforementioned fish tank. The sound from the fish tank, I think, describes 2 purposes. First, it's a sensory indicator that water is important. This will continue throughout the film. The pool is a central figure, especially, and the fish tank makes another appearance. So I think the film is signifying water's importance with that, audio cue, that sensory indicator. But additionally, I think it serves as another element that almost overwhelms Ben in that opening scene. In addition to, the visual blocks, there's also the sound of the fish tank bubbling whenever he's talking that threatens to overwhelm him. So we're getting some sonic overwhelming, some visual overwhelming, introducing this theme early, emphasizing that he is being perhaps run over, perhaps feeling isolated, Next scene I'll show is Ben giving Mrs. Robinson a ride home. She then asks him to come inside until she gets the lights on. She then, again, due to him having no agency, coerces him to stay, begins to seduce him. One of the striking visual elements in this part is the kind of strange jungle right outside the back door. Through the film, Mrs. Robinson has predatory characteristics ascribed to her. She frequently wears animal print clothing. She chooses Ben for prey and, kind of hunts him down in her own way. The jungle in the backyard is reflective of Mrs. Robinson's character, of that element of her character. The jungle, of course, we might, ascribe a sense of, danger, of hunting, of predatory nature, right? So this is something that's right in her backyard. And another strength of cinema, I think, is how it's not limited to traditional reality. It might not make logical sense in the traditional sense to have, a jungle in your backyard. However, what does make logical sense is that the film is using that jungle to, again, reinforce something internal to that character, right? To visualize one of Mrs. Robinson's characteristics. A more visual reinforcement is in her wardrobe. I said she frequently wears animal print clothing, and I can't show all of that. But here's like another example, wearing this leopard print coat. Wardrobe is more than, simply faithful recreation of an era. It can also be a crucial reinforcement of a character. It reinforces the predatory jungle idea woven throughout the visuals and through the writing of Mrs. Robinson's character. This scene also contains one of the film's most iconic shots. This is Ben being framed through Mrs. Robinson's leg. Her leg provides, this frame within the frame, shrinking Ben's available space and kind of confining him within, this little nook here. It's foreshadowing also that she's trapping him within her influence. And he knows it, but he's trapped regardless. One of the lines, that's basically happening in this scene is him saying,
"Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me."
So he knows it. But I think something else that this shot is communicating is that what's Ben saying is true, right? Like this visual representation of him being trapped within her sexuality, more or less, is true, even though she denies it, just a minute later. We, the audience, get like that affirmation. We're right there with Ben. Then the next scene is the scuba diving. Ben's parents want to show him off to their friends, essentially. Like he's their status symbol in a form or another, rather than a person that they just want the best for. They give him the scuba suit, they want him to show it off. And the clearest cinematic element here is the isolated sound. And of course, isolation being key again. There's all this hubbub around him, right? Like we see the image of people making a lot of sound, clamoring, yelling, signaling to him. But he can't hear any of it. He's unaffected by the excitement, right? He is feeling kind of deadened. He does not experience the same levels of, emotional intensity, excitement, happiness that the people around him seem to. Visually, he's again in a restricted frame, just like this smaller ovular section is available to him. Again, feeling blocked in, compressed by everything around him. Then we see water play a part yet again. This time the parents are literally pushing him down into it. They're kind of forcing him further into that water, which seems to represent this isolation from everyone around him, from things you might expect to bring him happiness. Finally, the camera's here underwater, pulling out, and we're just getting more and more of the empty, isolating water. There's basically nothing for him to cling on to in this situation. He's got no outs. The only thing he really has is the sound of breathing to remind him that he's alive. Now, going along with that idea of him having basically no outs, basically just complete isolation at this point, here the film splits the audio and video. It's no longer synchronous. We keep the image of him underwater, isolated, but over top of that, we get the sound of him calling Mrs. Robinson.
Hello?
I don't quite know how to put this.
Benjamin?
And this is important because it's going along with that sort of last-ditch idea. He's surrounded by this isolation. He has no outs. The only thing he has at all, the only person he has at this point is Mrs. Robinson. So it's just like his last-ditch effort in the middle of all this isolation. That's the context for that phone call. That's the importance of including that image. It's emphasizing he's stuck. This is the only thing he has at this point. And then this fourth scene is, I think, a little bit simpler. It's just a shot composition I like a lot. This is at the hotel. Ben is waiting for Mrs. Robinson. The hotel clerk spots him and tries to help him out. This composition, again, beautifully reflects the internal state of Ben, one of the strongest strengths of film. It's reflecting his internal, typically invisible state. Right now, Ben is basically just trying to hide, as he knows he's doing something he's going to regret. So notice again, the frame is limited. It's congested by like this scroll work in the bottom part. The camera is half hidden behind it. It's peeking out behind it like a child peeking out of a hiding spot. The clerk moves around to get like this sight line on Ben. He goes right in between this gap in the woodwork. He's finding Ben as he's, internally trying to hide. And then the shot reverse shot continues with both of their faces framed between two pieces of wood. They're talking relatively normally, normal volume, everything like that. It doesn't sound like they're trying to hide. If you just heard this conversation, it would sound fairly normal.
Here for an affair, sir?
What?
The Singleman party, sir?
Oh, yes, the Singleman party.
But if you add like this visual context of this like confinement, right, between these two pieces that Ben is experiencing, I think that's so much more meaningful because, again, we're continuing this idea from the water. He has almost no options. He's just trying to find something that breaks him out of this, that helps him make sense of the world, that helps him gain agency. But at this point in the film, he's got no agency. He is still kind of stuck between, those two pieces of wood that he is visually trapped between. The frame is, again, very limited. He's got this much space in the whole frame, and that's indicating his internal state externally. Even beyond the thematic and, emotional meaning, I just love this as a shot, as an interesting composition. If you can fit interesting images, these, just little flourishes even, into a film, that makes them uniquely cinematic. This, of course, goes for any film element. You can do this with any artistic area, any technical area, right? Things like the asynchronous editing from earlier, the production design, putting the jungle in the backyard, sound flourishes, these are all things that heighten the experience. Take it from being just a series of literal events to scenes that have depth and meaning and layers and things that have so much more to take in than just simple procedure. To be able to take a mundane, quote unquote, type of film like a sitcom and inject it with all this technical and artistic and visual flair and meaning, to me, that is cinematic. It's not the only way to be cinematic, but it is a way to be cinematic. Every film can be. It's utilizing the medium to its full extent, and I think that's what The Graduate does, and I think that's what being cinematic means. So do you like The Graduate? Are there any other films like it that you can think of that have, this definition of cinematic that you might not expect? Let me know in the comments. And hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.